Isaiah 25 was written during a time of significant political, social, and religious upheaval in Israel and Judah. Isaiah's ministry spanned over 4 decades, during which he witnessed the decline of Israel. He prophesied during a period when the tribes of Israel were divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The Assyrian Empire was expanding its influence westward, posing a severe threat to both kingdoms. Israel's kings sought alliances with neighboring nations, including Damascus, to counter Assyria, but Judah, under King Ahaz, allied itself with Assyria, a decision Isaiah condemned. Isaiah repeatedly warned the leaders to rely on God, not on political alliances. Social inequality was rampant. The elite class in Judah exploited the common people, leading to widespread corruption and social injustice. Isaiah consistently criticized the leaders for their greed and failure to care for the poor and marginalized. Religiously, Israel and Judah were plagued by idolatry and unfaithfulness to the covenant with Yahweh. Many had turned to pagan gods, adopting the religious practices of neighboring nations. Isaiah begins with a declaration of personal praise to God. Despite the turmoil around him, Isaiah recognizes God's perfect faithfulness and praises him for the wonderful things he has done. This verse reflects Isaiah's deep trust in God's sovereignty, even in times of distress. You have made the city a heap of rubble. This verse describes God's judgment on nations that opposed him. Isaiah foresees the destruction of mighty cities that stand as symbols of human pride and power. These cities represent national political systems that have defied God's authority, and they demonstrate the ultimate futility of human opposition to divine sovereignty. Isaiah prophesies that even the most powerful nations, countries once enemies of God, will eventually recognize God's supremacy. This verse reflects the prophetic vision of a future when all nations, including those who were once hostile to Israel, will acknowledge God's reign. Remember, Israel's systems were designed to advantage the rich and oppress the poor. In praising God, Isaiah foresees a change in the natural order at that time. Those nations and people who are so strong and now oppress others will honor God. The oppressed will find relief. God's justice is portrayed as a refuge for those who suffer under oppressive systems. Using analogies that the poor could relate to, the prophet says that God is a shelter from these hardships. When Isaiah writes about the uproar of foreigners, he is talking about the hostile nations that have risen against God and his people. Just as clouds bring relief from the oppressive heat, God's intervention brings peace and silences the tumult of those who oppress. We see here that Isaiah envisions a grand eschatological feast that God will prepare for all nations. The imagery of rich food and fine wine signifies abundance and celebration, symbolizing the blessings of God's kingdom. The shroud and sheet represent the death and sorrow that envelop all humanity. But praise God, Isaiah foresees the destruction of death. This points to the ultimate victory over suffering and mortality. All of this is fulfilled in the resurrection through Jesus Christ. Next, Isaiah speaks of the response of God's people after experiencing his deliverance. He says that they will acknowledge God's faithfulness and express joy in his salvation. Isaiah gives hope that the stresses of this world will be wiped away. Our trust in God is vindicated, and the people will celebrate their redemption. This is a picture of faith rewarded and God's salvation fully realized. The mountain refers to Zion, symbolizing God's presence with his people. This verse encapsulates the peace and protection that come from God's rule. His hand resting on the mountain signifies his enduring presence and favor upon his people. Our lesson speaks powerfully to modern Christians about the themes of deliverance, justice, and hope, encouraging us as believers to place our trust in God. In times of certainty and in times of uncertainty, when we are standing before our personal giants with just a sling and a stone. Just as Isaiah trusted in God's plan during difficult times, modern Christians are called to trust in God's faithfulness, even when circumstances seem overwhelming. Faith, as Isaiah demonstrates, is not based on what is seen, but on the assurance of God's promises. Isaiah's vision of a grand banquet and the destruction of death reminds believers that God's ultimate plan is for their deliverance. This passage reassures Christians that suffering and death will be swallowed up and joy and peace will prevail. In a world that still places additional burdens upon those who are poor and marginalized, Isaiah, even today, highlights God's concern for the poor and oppressed. Christians today are called to reflect God's justice by caring for those in need, standing against systems of oppression, and providing refuge for the marginalized. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week.